August 3rd, 2021. This was a photo somebody sent me, somebody pretending to be me. How we can really craft an argument. And clearly there was a Carole Baskin fan out there. Big Cat Public Safety Act, the false claim of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service / USDA agency duplication or conflict, by Scott Smith of Turpentine Creek Wildlife Refuge, Arkansas, and Howard Baskin of Big Cat Rescue, Florida. In 2003, Congress amended the Lacey Act by unanimously passing the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, recognizing that dangerous big cats should not be pets. While that act did limit some activity, during the 18 years since then, first responders have continued to have to face down these 300-pound-plus predators across the country. The primary source of the proliferation of these big cats is the cub petting industry. The cubs can only be used for a few months before they become too big and dangerous to handle. There is no tracking of what happens to them after they age out of cub petting. They simply disappear, many, we believe, illegally sold to unlicensed private owners. In our view, the most notorious of these cub exploiters is Doc Antle in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Based on visitor reports, he pumps out dozens of cubs each year. Antle is currently under indictment for 15 counts of animal abuse and illegal trafficking. His lobbyist, Frank Vitello, has reportedly been telling legislators that the Big Cat Public Safety Act does not belong in the Lacey Act, and that it creates duplication between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA, and that the bill creates some kind of conflict between the two agencies. This is absolute nonsense. Lacey Act. Clearly, the unanimous vote passing the Captive Wildlife Safety Act in 2003 indicates agreement that the bill appropriately amended the Lacey Act. The Big Cat Public Safety Act belongs as an amendment to the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, which amended the Lacey Act because it basically closes loopholes in that prior act to accomplish its purpose. If the argument Vitello is making is that cub petting as an activity falls exclusively under the Animal Welfare Act, and therefore USDA authority, the recent federal court ruling in the case against another Tiger King character, Tim Stark, proves that false. The court ruled that taking cubs from their mothers at birth and using them for cub petting violated the Endangered Species Act. In fact, there are rules regarding the Endangered Species Act in the Animal Welfare Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Lacey Act. Animal Welfare Act has no exclusivity. It is perfectly appropriate for the Big Cat Public Safety Act to amend and improve upon the previous passed Captive Wildlife Safety Act, i.e., amend the Lacey Act further, and for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has always been the agency charged with enforcing the Lacey Act, to enforce this amendment to it, USDA. As confirmed in its conversations with Dr. Laurie Gage, the USDA's big cat and marine mammal specialist, the Big Cat Public Safety Act does not change anything at USDA or require USDA to do anything. USDA is only mentioned in the bill because USDA licensees are exempt as long as they do not offer cub petting. The only likely impact of the bill on USDA is to make their job of inspection and enforcement easier, because without the exhibitors having the need to constantly pump out cubs for petting, there would be far fewer tigers to inspect, and the agency would no longer have to investigate citizen complaints that today are filed by people upset at the mistreatment they see at cub petting operations. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Vitello's most blatant false argument is that under the Big Cat Public Safety Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would do inspections like USDA does, creating duplication, expense, and possible conflict. Here is a quote from a document we believe Vitello circulated to House members in his effort to thwart the successful bipartisan suspension vote of the Big Cat Public Safety Act in the House in December of 2020. It was then H.R. 1380. Quote, H.R. 1380 would result in massive expansion of government by now requiring the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to inspect wildlife facilities to ensure the requirement of H.R. 1380 are being met. Not only is this duplicative and wasteful, but there is no new budget authority included in H.R. 1380 to carry out any of this work, unquote. This is a total fabrication. USDA has inspectors who regularly inspect licensees. Separately, USDA has a smaller number of investigators. After repeated violations are cited by inspectors, the case is sometimes referred to USDA investigators, who focus on building a case for court prosecution if they deem it appropriate. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in contrast, does not have inspectors of big cat facilities. They only have investigators who would only visit big cat owners if they had some reason to believe they had broken the law. This is usually triggered by receiving some kind of information from a third party. This is exactly what U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does now, and what they did, for instance, in the Joe Exotic prosecution. There were no inspections by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of the GW Zoo. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agent became aware of a possible criminal violation of the Lacey Act and the Endangered Species Act, investigated and worked with the Department of Justice and FBI to bring the charges for illegally killing 5 tigers, Endangered Species Act, and for illegal trafficking in tiger cubs by falsifying transfer paperwork, Lacey Act, and Endangered Species Act. All the Big Cat Public Safety Act requires U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do that is different from their normal role of investigating suspected violations of the Endangered Species Act and the Lacey Act is to just one time create a simple database of cats owned by those current owners who are not licensed by USDA and who want to keep their cats under the grandfather clause of the bill. This one-time census is necessary so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would have a way to know if an owner without a USDA license violated the law by breeding or acquiring more cats than are grandfathered in. This census has a nominal cost. There are no inspections of these owners by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services to monitor compliance. There are only investigations if U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a reason to believe there is a violation, i.e., the same activity U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does now, without any involvement or conflict from the USDA. Trafficking in endangered species has always been the purview of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, not USDA. The Joe Exotic case was unusual because there was an informant. Without that, the cub trafficking done in using cash transactions is almost impossible to detect. The cub petting is what drives the trafficking. It would not be profitable to breed tiger cubs just to sell them illegally for $5,000, but it is profitable to breed a cub, make $100,000 over 3 months charging people to pet it, then get a little extra profit by selling it for $5,000. Ending the cub petting is a classic example of combating trafficking by curtailing the supply. And it belongs under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because they, not USDA, are the agency charged with oversight over trafficking. Conflict between USDA current rules and the Big Cat Public Safety Act. Patello also seems to argue that since USDA does not currently ban cub petting in its minimum standards, which is what USDA is charged with creating and enforcing, the Big Cat Public Safety Act ending cub petting somehow conflicts with this. If USDA required exhibitors to offer cub petting, then the Big Cat Public Safety Act forbidding it would be a conflict. But USDA is silent on the subject. It is not a conflict. By banning cub petting, the Big Cat Public Safety Act simply puts into legislative form for national uniformity what the federal courts are already finding, with no conflict with USDA rules. Comments of former director of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Dan Nash is a former director of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from 2011 to 2017, and currently the president and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. When asked about the claim that the Big Cat Public Safety Act creates some overlap or conflict between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA, he said, quote, "It is completely false to claim that passage of this law would create confusion or conflict between these agencies," unquote. Conclusion. In 2011, when Big Cat Rescue and others surveyed the cub petting industry, we found 56 exhibitors who engaged in this activity. Over the last decade, some have closed, some have stopped doing cub petting, and find that they have successful businesses without it. And particularly in recent years, a number of the most prominent ones have been shut down by law enforcement actions. Most notably in the latter category are Dade City Wild Things, Jeff Lowe, the successor to Joe Exotic, and Tim Stark. Today, we can only count 5 exhibitors left who do cub petting, but they are still estimated to be producing over 100 cubs each year, who are unwanted after the brief few months of exploitation for cub petting. This results in mistreatment of these innocent cubs, adult animals who spend their lives in inhumane conditions, and danger to all first responders all over the country. The simple, obvious solution is the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which does just 2 things. 1, It ends the cub petting that drives the rampant breeding and resultant trafficking. And 2, it phases out ownership by individuals not licensed or overseen by USDA, grandfathering in their existing cats. We believe Mr. Antle and his lobbyist have no legitimate arguments to raise to oppose this common sense legislation, so we believe they have to fabricate a smokescreen of confusion by repeating vague, totally untrue assertions that the bill somehow creates conflict or overlap between the two agencies. This is totally false. USDA is totally unaffected, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does exactly what it already does without conflict or overlap in the subject area that falls appropriately under its jurisdiction. The selfish, pecuniary interests of one man under indictment on animal-related criminal charges who can afford a lobbyist should not outweigh the safety interests of first responders all over the country. Can that man write a letter or what? I just love Howie. If you're enjoying my diary, please like, share, and subscribe. You can find other ways to connect to me over at bigcatrescue.org/Carole.Baskin.